Welcome to the Escaping Extinction podcast. Today we're talking with Beto Borges, the Director of Forest Trends Community and Territorial Governance Initiative. With over 30 years' experience working with indigenous communities, Beto explains the huge value they deliver, not only in preserving our forest and biodiversity, but also their wealth of knowledge has been passed down generations, ranging from medicine to agriculture. We also cover the alarming trends taking place across Latin America and their impacts on the communities. Now, for those wanting to delve even deeper into the topic after listening, check out the podcast description below to see the reports mentioned throughout the conversation. I learned a ton during this conversation, and I'm sure you will too. Enjoy. Hi, Beto. Great to have you with us today. Before we kick off, is it worthwhile you doing a quick introduction of Forest Trends and what you do?
Sure, Mike. Thank you for having me here today. Yes, my name is Beto Borges. I'm the Director of Forest Trends Communities and Territorial Governance Initiative. Forest Trends is a US-based organization. Our headquarters office is in Washington, D.C. And really the mission of Forest Trends, in a nutshell, is to provide economic incentives for conservation. We have a few programs, and the program, as I said, that I run is the Communities Initiative for short. And what the Community Initiative does, the Communities and Territorial Governance Initiative, we work with indigenous communities and other local communities to provide, to support their governance of their forest homelands, the integrated governance through three key approaches or pillars of work, areas of work, which are advocacy, economic resilience, and cultural strengthening. And I can elaborate more in what we do in each of these areas. But essentially, it's to provide financial support and technical support for indigenous peoples and other local communities, really to increase their capacity to defend their territorial rights and implement strategies and activities that in the long run will really provide for the good governance of their territories, so resulting in standing forests, strong cultures, and improved livelihoods.
Great. And is that in purely Latin America, or are you doing other kind of geographies as well?
Yeah, good question. We are focused nowadays, geographic focus is Latin America. Some years ago, I've been with Forest Trends for the past 15 years directing this program. However, I've been working with local communities, indigenous peoples, local communities for about 32 years or so, 32 years. I'm Brazilian. I've done a lot of work in Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America. I've worked for other major organizations such as Rainforest Action Network, running their Amazon program, and then on to other organizations. And then with Forest Trends for the past 15 years. In the early days, we began doing some work in Africa, but given the cultural complexities and the other complexities in Africa, and we figured that we would concentrate in Latin America, also because of the distribution of tropical forests in Latin America, primarily in the Amazon. 25, if I get my numbers right, 25% of all tropical forests, they are in Latin America. So that is, Amazon in itself, it's a huge reservoir of tropical forests, of which 240 million hectares are the homelands of indigenous peoples in the Amazon alone. So think of that in terms of avoided emissions and carbon stocks, cultural richness, biodiversity treasures, and so on and so forth. So because of these reasons, we decided to focus in Latin America. That's where we've been doing our work. We did some interesting work in Africa, in Uganda, for the most part, and some work in Mozambique. in Ghana, but that was in the beginning. Another interesting fact about the community initiatives at Forest Trends is that we incubated the Rights and Resources Initiative in the early days. When I came in, I joined Forest Trends. I was tasked to also implement local hands-on activities, projects, in addition to research, to really to really put to practice what our theory in forest conservation is about, working with directly with local communities. And at the time, the community initiatives at Forest Trends, just prior to my joining, was the Rights and Resources Initiative. We actually incubated the Rights and Resources Initiative, which is a very important organization, in fact, a coalition run by the Rights and Resources RRG, Rights and Resources Group, which is the organization that runs it out of Washington, D.C., and runs the Rights and Resources Initiative, which stands for and promotes the land tenure rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And whereas the community initiative at Forest Trends promotes the governance of indigenous and local communities territories. And the reason that I'm emphasizing that it is because that rights, land tenure rights without good governance do not sustain itself. And rights without governance cannot sustain itself in the long run. And governance without rights, without tenure rights, there is no reason to be. So rights and governance go hand in hand. And Forest Trends continues to be a founding member of the Rights and Resources Initiative, which is an organization that does a lot of important research in terms of advocating for the land tenure rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And we do a lot of work to, once those rights are in place, not only once those rights are in place, but overall, to really promote the good governance of indigenous peoples and local communities territories in Latin America primarily.
Great. And given you're on the ground and kind of at the forefront, what are the key trends you're seeing that are affecting indigenous communities and rural communities as well?
My friend, well, the key trends are unfortunately not that what would be the word? The key trends are not that great, for the lack of a better word, are horrible. Maybe that's a better word, for sure, because the key trends are onslaught of invasion of indigenous territories by unsustainable forces of so-called development, illegal invasion of indigenous people's territories and local communities' territories, be it for gold, for diamond, for oil drilling, land, road building, and other infrastructure development projects, cattle ranching, the expansion of the agribusiness frontier for the production of commodities, as well as all kinds of commodities, but primarily beef, soy, palm oil, and cattle. Those are the main drivers of deforestation, commodity-driven deforestation, those four. In fact, Forest Trends has just launched a very important report, Illicit Harvest and Complicit Goods. Illicit Harvest, Complicit Goods, where we point out that, I believe, now I don't have the study in front of me, but about 85% of all commodities produced are produced illegally globally, and in Latin America, that is in Brazil alone, I believe the study, take it back, 65% let me just actually pull that report up. Let's see if I can do that quickly while we're talking, because this is an important figure based on the question you just asked me. So with the trends of that are affecting indigenous peoples and local communities. So again, the report, it's called Illicit Harvest and Complicit Goods. Let's see here. You can also put that report on your computer there, Illicit Harvest and Complicit Goods.
Yeah, I'll include it in the description so people can read it in detail.
Great. And yeah, the major commodities that are causing deforestation are, cattle, soy, and beef. The report speaks to the total tropical forest loss between 2013 and 2019 of 7 million hectares, which is a lot of it when you think of the land tenureship of indigenous peoples. A lot of it has been also lands occupied by indigenous peoples. And here's the data that I was looking for. At least 69% of agro conversion was conducted in violation of national laws and regulations, and this is likely underestimated. So 69% of tropical forest deforestation caused by commodity-driven deforestation, and 85% in Brazil alone. So, in fact, here, take it back, 95% of all deforestation in Brazil was illegal. So, and back to your question, so the trends to indigenous peoples and local communities of rights and rights to their lands are very, very worrisome, given this statistics. And given what's happening, you just opened the news, and last year we had the major fires happening in the Amazon, with not a lot of action by the federal government in Brazil, which now promotes. I think it's fair to say that at least in Brazil, the federal government is promoting, the agricultural frontier to encroach upon the Amazon, has backroad several policies, has dismantled the different agencies that are tasked to enforce command and control policies, such as IBAMA, and also dismantled the National Indian Agency, FUNAI, and has sort of created this climate, which is a climate of that's anti-indigenous rights in Brazil. So creating this sort of idea that indigenous peoples are a barrier to development in Brazil, which is a major short-sightedness way of seeing the contributions of indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples, like I said earlier, they are stewards of 240 million hectares of forests in the Amazon alone, not to speak globally. That represents about 45 to 50 gigatons of carbon stocks in the forests. Also, there is an important study by Leeds University in England that speaks to the role of indigenous forest homelands, the role of this forest in also avoiding emissions, not only in holding carbon stocks, but avoiding emissions. When you add to that other ecosystem services, such as the provision of clean water, as well as the biodiversity that is contained within indigenous people's forests, it is tremendous. There is also research done by Professor Susanna Hecht at the University of California in Los Angeles. She's done research over several years, Professor Susanna Hecht, about what she calls coevolution of indigenous peoples with their surrounding forest, which has a direct implication in biodiversity because of the way in which indigenous peoples interact with the natural environment around them, the way in which they rotate their food systems, their crops, and so on, and how they move throughout the forest, and then you have a seeds disbursement as a result of their crop systems, the traditional crop systems, as well as their management of other plants, medicinal plants. And that's another a huge contribution of indigenous cultures is their intellectual property knowledge related to their natural resource base, to the medicinal plants that are found and known by indigenous peoples. One example of that, and this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of this immense knowledge that indigenous peoples have of their forests, and specifically of medicinal plants. One indigenous group in Brazil, and Brazil, by the way, is one of the countries in the world where you have the most indigenous cultures. We have about 270 distinct indigenous cultures in
Wow.
Brazil. Yeah, speaking different languages. Some languages are come from the same linguistic root, but there's tremendous cultural diversity within indigenous cultures in Brazil. And one of this indigenous group, the Yawanawa, in the state of Acre, in the western Brazilian Amazon, bordering with Peru, in the state of Acre, where you have 4 million hectares approximately held by indigenous peoples, demarcated lands of indigenous peoples, distributed in 34 indigenous territories or distinct indigenous groups. The Yawanawa is one of them. They live in a forest, their homeland, that is about 200,000 hectares. And within that forest, over generations, the Yawanawa have cultivated this knowledge, nourished this traditional knowledge of about 2,000 medicinal plants, distinct medicinal plants, 2,000. And in the history of their people, there has never been a death as a result of poisonous snake bite. They have, out of those 2,000 plants, they have the knowledge of about 17 plants that are used specifically for the treatment of poison snake bites. And believe me, there are a lot of poison snake bites, poisonous snakes in the Amazon. So, and there has never been a death. So that's one area, for instance, when I mentioned earlier, where we work at Forest Trends Communities and Territorial Governance Initiative, the work that we do around cultural strengthening, we have a specific program that we call Living Pharmacy, where we work with indigenous peoples to carry on this tremendous and important knowledge of medicinal plants from the old generation to the younger generation, so that this knowledge can be preserved, but primarily for their own use, so that they can continue to treat their communities. And by cultivating these medicinal plants, teaching the younger generation how to cultivate, how to identify, cultivate, and use these medicinal plants. So, so this is also an example of an ecosystem service, which is that of biodiversity, that indigenous peoples are stewards of, therefore providers of this ecosystem service, as they are providers of carbon, of climate, climate mitigation, and flying rivers is another, the water that is produced out of the Amazon. So then, for people to think that indigenous peoples are a barrier to development is a very short-sighted, backward vision of development. To think that the Amazon is worth more for producing soy and cattle than the value of the biodiversity that is contained is that it's so short-sighted and stupid that it's hard to believe that at this stage of human development, there is still that mindset that is unfortunately is still dominating the course of development in the Amazon. A lot has been said nowadays about natural-based solutions. You open the paper, you read natural-based solutions. The financial industry is talking about natural-based solutions. Everybody know, the new trend is natural-based solutions, which is great. But indigenous peoples have been practicing natural-based solutions for generations.
Yeah.
And more attention is needed on what the solutions are the solutions that are coming from indigenous peoples, the way in which they nourish their forests. So the trends again are very concerning because deforestation is skyrocketing in the Amazon. You just look at the figures. A good source of data for that in terms of Brazilian deforestation is Amazon, IMAZON. Amazon, our colleagues there, very established research organization that has been tracking deforestation in Brazil. But the trends in general of deforestation in the Amazon, unfortunately, is increasing. RAISG, RAISG, RISE is also a consortium of some important organizations working with the Amazon, has been monitoring the trend of deforestation in relation to some of the main vectors of deforestation, such as soy, palm, beef, and cattle. Also, Forest Trends has a program called Supply Chain, where we also monitor the trend of deforestation around these major commodities, soy, beef, palm, and oil, and also what the companies that drive this commodities, what are their commitments in terms of bringing more, changing their sourcing practices to promote more sustainable sourcing. And so we track that, and it's not the program that I run, but so we think that that work is very important as well.
So you mentioned around nature-based solutions, and obviously the carbon market is probably the biggest one at the moment, particularly around putting a price on a forest, for example, from the carbon sequestered, which I'm conscious it's nothing in terms of the valuation compared to all the other services and values that the indigenous communities bring. But I'm conscious also that deforestation on indigenous lands is around 11 times lower than on surrounding lands. I was wondering whether this has an impact on their ability for them to participate in the carbon market.
You think it should, right? One would think it should. I mean, at least many of us in the conservation and indigenous rights community. Well, we think that climate finance has been so far unfair to the rights of indigenous peoples, to their carbon ownership rights. The flow of carbon finance has been unequal proportionally to the contribution of indigenous peoples to climate mitigation. And the reason I believe for that is that the architecture of climate finance, such as in the RED mechanism, reduce emissions for degradation and deforestation, has this this thing called additionality, right? Which throws off the great majority of indigenous peoples' territories because they're considered that they have no imminent threat of deforestation. You know, lands, indigenous lands that are remote. To begin with, the concept of remoteness, it's also very Western centric. You know, remote from where? You know, when we think, you know,
yeah.
So remote from Europe, remote from North America. You know, it's not remote for indigenous peoples. That's their homeland.
Yeah.
In the same way that your home is not remote to you, my home is not remote to me. Paris is not remote to Parisians. London is not remote to how do you say Londons?
Yeah, I'm not Londoners. I'm not sure the exact term for it. Yeah.
Or the good people of London. Love London. It's a beautiful city, great people. So our homes are not remote to us. Therefore, indigenous people's territories shouldn't be considered to be remote. And but technically speaking, also, I was, you know, additionality, technically speaking, I also think is inaccurate. And I think it's a big thing to say. I would think that people listening to this would think, well, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, especially our good people that are doing research. And I value, of course, a lot of tremendous good technical work that has been done around this. But when I say that it's inaccurate, is connected to your earlier question, is what are the trends that are affecting indigenous peoples? The trends are the worst that you can think of in terms of the increasing rates of deforestation. So additionality speaks to where the baseline is and where deforestation is taking place and what is meant to be deforested, right, in relation to your baseline. And whether you can avoid deforestation to continue and so on and so forth. But the fact is that where is additionality going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now? So it's inaccurate in the sense of the timeline.
Yeah.
You know, when you look back in the history of the Amazon and deforestation that has happened in the past 10 years, and you look back deforestation in the past 20 years, so additionality is only addressing the current trends of deforestation, but not really dealing with future trends of deforestation. And worse, earlier I mentioned RISE, this coalition that monitors deforestation in the Amazon. And when you look at those maps, it's really alarming because you see they overlay indigenous forest territories and other conservation units, national parks, state parks throughout the Amazon, and all the different concessions for extractive industries that overlay on top of those territories. You know, think, for instance, mining and oil concessions. And this is data that we have access to, right? Oil mining concessions. So where is additionality dealing? How does additionality deal with the concessions that are already approved by the governments as a result of their macro development plans and policies in terms of promoting development in the Amazon and other tropical forests around the globe? And this is what we are aware of. there's so much that we are not aware of.
Mm.
In terms of what is being planned by governments around the globe in terms of putting new roads here and there. So I guess what I'm saying is that when I say additionality is an inaccurate way to to create a sort of a rationale for providing economic incentives for conservation and dealing with climate change, is because in the line of time, we don't know where the next frontier of deforestation, well, we can predict, but we don't know for sure. But the trend that we've been observed is that it's only going to increase.
Mm.
So then our arguments, not only mine, but the Forest Trends Community Initiative and our team, our argument is that additionality it's not enough, because are we going to wait for these other indigenous territories, which makes the bulk of indigenous forests in the Amazon, again 240 million hectares? Are we going to wait? Oh, now we have additionality. Now we can include these territories. Let's wait deforestation to encroach upon indigenous territories. Take, for instance, the department or state of Caquetá in Colombia, which is completely covered with forests. The great majority of the northern Amazon, it's still fairly intact for the most part. Are we going to wait deforestation to get there? Okay, now RED can be implemented in these places. So we think that RED is a really good instrument that can provide financial flows to jurisdictions and government-led jurisdictions, and also projects as well. But we think that this limitation is limited by its very own architecture. So, and I think we need to think out of the RED box. I think RED should be maintained. It should be more resources should go for RED. I think more policies, need to enable RED to do what it can do, and I think it can do a lot of good, but I don't think it's enough. I think there needs to be a RED plus plus plus, or a RED plus alpha, or something that really goes beyond this sort of the narrow way of considering additionality in the short timeline. Because again, these indigenous territories are there, indigenous peoples are there, but where RED can play a role with indigenous peoples' territories, and there are a lot of places where RED can also benefit indigenous peoples, because you have indigenous territories that are in the lower belt, or the belt of deforestation in the Amazon, which is the the southern border, if you will, of the Amazon. A lot of states where deforestation is really rampant, such as the state of Rondônia in Brazil, the state of Pará, the state of Mato Grosso, where you have several indigenous territories, large territories, 200,000, 300,000 hectares, and so on and so forth. RED can play a role, but I don't think that is doing as best as it could. And the reason being is because too much trust is placed on the governments that are receiving this climate financing that is coming from bilateral agencies, such as KfW, such as DFID, such as USAID, and NICFI in Norway, funding programs that are a lot of trust is placed on jurisdictional systems. Now there is a new important program that has just been launched called LEAF, right? Lower emissions, advancing finance, I think that's what it stands for, LEAF. It's a program that is that has committed $1 billion in to purchase emissions reductions from tropical forests countries, financed by the United States, UK, and Norway so far, plus several major companies, Amazon, Bayer, Unilever, Nestle, and others. And they have now a call for proposals due by July 30th, wherein governments need to submit proposals demonstrating how they will control deforestation and therefore avoiding emissions in order to, essentially sell the project or emissions reductions to the program. But again, jurisdictional programs, I think they can be good. However, they are very risky from the standpoint of too much trust in the governments that they will really control deforestation, and especially that they will include indigenous peoples and local communities. Jurisdictional programs funded by bilaterals, such as the Red Early Movers Program, funded by KfW, and I believe NICFI as well, fund that program. It's a great program, and and it has a condition of disbursement for governments that receive funding to have effective benefit sharing mechanisms, which are based on safeguards, for the most part, the Cancun safeguards that inform this benefit sharing mechanisms. But the Cancun safeguards are very important, right? However, in practice, those of us that have been working closely with indigenous peoples, I have been working with indigenous peoples myself, and I'm not the only one by any means. But I've been working with indigenous peoples in the Amazon for the past 30 years. And the course of history is an evidence that we can't entirely trust the governments, the local governments, to really bring about truthful benefit sharing mechanisms if if this same mechanisms that are or these financial flows don't also create resources for indigenous peoples to be able to monitor the implementation of this benefit sharing mechanisms. Not only monitor, but also, and most importantly, to be co-creators of those benefit sharing mechanisms. Also, it's important that benefit sharing and climate finance and conservation finance, not only the benefit sharing aspect of it, it is extremely important to create to bring into the design of this mechanisms and flows aspects of cultural appropriateness, because the way in which financial flows are measured, this whole discussion about payment for performance, is really measured from the standpoint of Western societies, from the minds and the bright, really bright minds, and I'm not being sarcastic, the bright minds of people that are behind this important bilateral agencies that are, and I really believe in the best intentions, providing flows to really mitigate climate change, to stop deforestation. We completely believe that all these agencies are well-meaning, but however, they are limited by how they see the world. We are limited by how they see the world. how we see the world. I am limited by the way I see the world. So I can't think as an indigenous person think because I'm not one, right? I respect them. So and I think that when this financial flows are designed and how they are implemented through the metrics through which they're measured, um, there needs to be more a co-participatory process so that there are ways that indigenous peoples can demonstrate that their forest stewardship results in climate conservation, results in emissions reduction, results in carbon stocks conserved, that don't necessarily have to be measured in the same sort of is very strict metric systems or measuring systems, monitoring and evaluation systems that are imposed upon indigenous peoples when they are, in the few instances that they are lucky to benefit from some of these financial flows, such as in the case of the Red Early Movers program, that they have to, and I've seen happen many times, indigenous peoples really struggling to comply with reporting demands from funding agencies and foundations equally, that is philanthropic foundations, that are put upon indigenous peoples a lot of requirements that, for one, are not culturally appropriate, and they don't yet have the sort of the administrative financial capacity to to report against those metrics, indicators, and what have you. I'm not saying that one shouldn't measure progress. That's not at all what I'm saying. But yes, we should measure, but we should work with indigenous peoples to come up with complementary ways, innovative ways to measure their quote unquote performance, right? That could even be disrespectful to ask, well, an indigenous group, well, we're going to have to measure your performance to see if you're performing. Well, they've been performing. Just look around, just go, just take some satellite imagery, you see how they are performing over the course of time. So, but again, my point here is international community, the conservation community, and the agencies, and all those that are doing good work to promote forest conservation. We need to work more in consonance with indigenous peoples to come up with effective ways, culturally appropriate ways to measure how their stewardship is really resulting in standing forests. And another point to this, in terms of this question about that you asked me, related to climate finance, in how climate finance is benefiting or not indigenous people and local communities, is another question that it's, or another fact that is even more important than distribution of resources, is a question that is at the core of what drives climate finance, which is the question of who owns the carbon rights.
Yeah,
carbon rights, right? When we launched the Surui Carbon Project, which was the first indigenous REDD+ project there came to be, the forest trends with the Surui people in Brazil, in the state of Rondônia, about 8 years ago or so, and some other partners, the Brazilian Fund for Biodiversity, FUNBio, Canindé, ECAN, and IDESAN, all Brazilian partners, with the Surui people when we launched the project. The project came to be as a result of a conversation I had at the time with Almir Surui, the leader, one of the chiefs of the Surui people in Brazil. Almir came to me. Before Forest Trends, I used to work for Goldman Foundation here in San Francisco. I was a program officer for the Goldman Foundation that yesterday we had the Goldman Environmental Prize winners. So I used to be to work for the selecting finalists for the prize, and I also work with grant giving at the Goldman Fund. And Almir Surui came to me and thinking that I was still, by then I was already working with Forest Friends. Almir said, Beto, could there be a grant for us, for the Surui, to finance we have a reforestation project here. And I asked Almir, I told him, I no longer give out grants. What I do now, is this. I work with Forest Friends and do this and that. But have you considered, Almir, financing our reforestation project through carbon sequestration? And do you know about that? So, no, I don't. And then we began talking about what is carbon sequestration, how a project in indigenous peoples' territories can be in the framework of carbon sequestration. And then we started to develop some studies, some viability studies, to see if we would have a project related to carbon sequestration. To make a long story short, it turned out that it didn't really work to do a carbon sequestration because we didn't have enough eligible areas in terms of that would eventually give enough credits as based on carbon sequestration alone. But through that studies, we realized that we had a really good case for a RED project, and that's where the project began. But before moving ahead, Forest Trends commissioned a study from Baker McKenzie, this important legal firm, to really sort of be sure that I conceptually and philosophically, and with also my understanding of the Brazilian legal system, I believe that indigenous peoples in Brazil had and have carbon ownership rights, but I wanted to be sure from the legal standpoint.
Yeah.
And we commissioned the study. They took 6 months. Baker McKenzie, Rodrigo Salles, important lawyer, led the study. Nowadays, he has his own practice in Brazil. So at the time, he was a principal of Baker McKenzie. He led the study. And after 6 months, they concluded that indigenous peoples, the Surui, not only the Surui have carbon ownership rights, but all indigenous peoples in Brazil that have their indigenous lands demarcated have the same carbon ownership rights as the Surui have, based on a very detailed revision of the legal framework in Brazil, beginning with the Brazilian Constitution, Chapter 231 of the Brazilian Constitution, that speaks on the rights of indigenous peoples, that says that indigenous peoples have the rights to exclusive rights, that is, to derive benefits from their territories, economic benefits from their territories, to usufruct rights, and to derive economic benefits from their territories. We presented those findings to FUNAI, the Brazilian Indian Agency at the time, in a 2-day workshop in Brasilia. FUNAI brought all its directors from all over Brazil. There were other important agencies there. The World Bank was present, and civil society organizations were present. And Forest Trends with Surui and other project partners, we presented the findings, the lawyers presented the findings. And FUNAI at the time, the president of FUNAI was anthropologist Marcio Meira. And he acknowledged that the study was correct. He acknowledged that FUNAI agreed that, and we have this recorded, right? Then there was all over the news. He acknowledged that indigenous peoples in Brazil have the rights to the carbon in their territories. And we said, oh, that's great, but that's not enough. Can FUNAI, can the government put this in writing? Can you formalize it? Thank you. Yes. And so, yeah, we're going to work on it. Sometime later, a year and a half later, the FUNAI passed this law, which is PNATI, PGNATI, is the national law for the environmental management in indigenous peoples' lands, which in it has a chapter that speaks to indigenous peoples having the rights to the ecosystem services derived from their territories. And they went beyond carbon rights. They put it into this national law that indigenous peoples have the rights to the ecosystem services in their territory. So therefore, they have the rights to carbon and as well to other ecosystem services. And this year, in January 2021, Brazil, the Brazilian federal government, passed a new law with Congress and all that, passed a new law that regulates payments for environmental services law in Brazil. And that law, you can look at it, has very clear, specific requirements for payments for environmental services to make indigenous peoples' territories a priority. Indigenous peoples should be priority stakeholders in the payments for environmental services. So, so then back to climate flows, financial flows deriving from climate conservation, to mitigate climate change. So climate finance, that is. And the fact that LEAF, this new program, RAIN, the Red Early Movers, and other climate finance programs are working only with providing funding only to governments. That begs the question, okay, are governments, to what extent are these local governments acknowledging and counting or deducting the carbon credits that should be derived from the indigenous people's territories? Some would say, well, that a lot of these indigenous lands are remote, they're not contributing to emissions reductions, but some of these countries, some of these jurisdictions, they are measuring carbon stock and flow. They're not just considering emissions reductions. They're also counting carbon stocks. So we think the distribution of resources, financial resources, is therefore unequal because not attention is placed on this big question, which is that of who owns the carbon. So we believe that indigenous peoples have the rights to their carbon. Again, the Rights and Resources Initiative just put out a really important research speaking to this point. That research has just been in an recent article by Manga Bay magazine. And again, perhaps one of my final messages, I think we're coming at the hour here, is for those of us and anyone, for that matter, that is concerned with climate change, is concerned with the loss of biodiversity and what that could represent in terms of future pandemics, to really pay more attention to the tremendous stewardship that indigenous peoples have of their forest territories, and that indigenous peoples don't be given just little, resources coming from the benefit sharing programs, but they are become true participants in how this flow of financing is conceptualized and put into practice.
Absolutely. I think this has been a really interesting conversation, Beto. I mean, I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners will as well. If they want to learn more about Forest Trends and what you do, where can they find out more?
Yeah, just thank you so much, Mike and Beef. It's fantastic initiative. I commend you guys for doing what you're doing. Yes, folks can look up for Forest Trends site. Just Google Forest Trends and Community Initiative, so you can get a hold of me that way. I also have a profile on LinkedIn, Beto Borges in LinkedIn. You can look for me that way. I will get back to you if you want to continue this conversation. And I didn't mean to offend anyone. It's just these are my views, the views of Forest Trends. I think that there is good value in a lot of people's work. I think, but it's only when we bring our heads together, we'll come up with the solution that we all need. Yes, and my email is bborges at foresttrends.org. Thank you so much, and all the best to you, Mike, and everyone.
Cheers, Beto.
Wishing peace and health to all. Thank you.
Cheers.